Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Lunchtime Discovery Series. Thanks for being here. Thank you for joining us for today's program. We've got a great show for you planned today for this Wednesday's Noontime Lunchtime program, brought to you by, of course, us here at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences. We run the technical stuff and bring you the broadcast every single week. It's hosted by me. I work for the museum. My name's Chris. Hi, everybody. But behind the scenes, working to bring this program to you and helping promote it every single week is the North Carolina Office of Environmental Education within the Department of Environmental Quality. The folks in that office are the ones who find our fabulous speakers and work to bring these conversations to you every single week. So between the two of us, we've got a great show planned for you. This month, in fact, all of February, the Office of Environmental Education is recognizing Black History Month. And so us at the museum are super excited to be able to bring these programs to you as well. This is Stories of Justice, Identity, and Cultural Heritage, sponsored by the Committee on Diversity and Inclusion within DEQ. So lots of folks working together to bring this month's very special programming to you. Today's super exciting, very special guest is broadcasting to us all the way from Chapel Hill, North Carolina. He's an assistant professor in the Department of Forestry and Environmental Resources at North Carolina State University. Everybody give a warm welcome to Dr. Louie Rivers.
All right, thank you for that introduction. And let me go straight to screen share so we can go ahead and get started. I was telling Chris before we got started, I'm glad I'm going first in this series of talks because the rest of the people are fantastic. So I'm glad I'm not coming after them.
We've got a great month lined up, but this one is equally just as great. I guarantee it.
Thank you for your introduction. I'll go ahead and get started. So, hopefully we'll have some time for questions and discussions near the end. So you saw the title of the talk, Equitable Resilience, Developing Solutions to Environmental Justice Problems in Southeast Raleigh. And we went back and forth on that title. And I think it's a great title, but I'll be honest with you, I'm just more going to present some ideas around environmental justice. I definitely do not have any concrete solutions for an issue as large as environmental justice. But what I do want to do today is present a little bit about myself and a lot about this kind of journey that one community has gone on, just one facet of environmental justice. So I'll go ahead and get started. So who am I? Why am I here today? My background, so I work at NC State. I am on faculty in forestry and environmental resources. I was trained theoretically to look at these ideas around risk and risk perception and judgment and decision-making. And I'm trained as a cognitive psychologist. So a lot of my training is in cognitive psychology. So I take these ideas, around risk and risk perception and judgment and decision-making, and I apply them in terms of looking at minority populations and underserved populations and how these groups interact with the natural environment. And specifically, through this frame of environmental justice, which we'll talk about a little bit more as we go through this talk. So this background and context leads to my central research interest, which is the examination of risk perception and decision-making processes and mechanisms in minority and underserved communities in the context of the natural and built environment. So I really study how do people in minority communities and underserved communities think about the environment and how do they make decisions around the environment? And increasingly, how do they have opportunities to be part of the governance of their local environment? And I would say maybe one of my primary research goals is that there's a serious inclusion of environmental justice into how we think about how these groups operate within the natural environment. And there's all types of different definitions of environmental justice. The federal government has one, the EPA has one, the state of North Carolina has its own definition. But when I think about environmental justice, I kind of think about these three core pillars that need to be addressed. And that's recognitional justice, procedural justice, and distributional justice. So this first one, recognitional justice, is like, we have to recognize that certain communities are not being able to, two things. They are not being able to take advantage of the best parts of the environment. So they often don't have access to like the beautiful parks or places that we have throughout our country and throughout our local communities. Conversely, they're often exposed to much more of the, kind of the nasty parts of the environment. They're much more exposed to the waste that we put into our environment. So this imbalance, we need to recognize that that's happening and recognize these communities. The next part is this idea of procedural justice. When we make decisions about where we gonna get rid of the waste that fuels our modern society, or where we gonna place a new park, we really need to do it in such a way where these communities' concerns are part of that process. They need to be part of the decision-making process of how we regulate and govern our natural environment. And then finally, and I think in some ways most importantly, is this idea of distributional justice. I tell people all the time, it's perfectly fine to have good process, but if we have good process and the outcomes are still bad, communities are still hurting. So we need to make sure that the environmental goods and environmental harms are equally distributed across society. And like, I think some people argue that, we're so seriously imbalanced that we're past the point of being equal. We really need to fix our processes and address the imbalances we see in many minority and underserved communities. So like, in all my work, I'm really trying to push for these environmental justice principles to come through. And over the last 6 or 7 years, which we'll talk about for a little while, this work has really focused on Southeast Raleigh and this idea of nuisance flooding, but honestly, it's focused on 2 neighborhoods in Southeast Raleigh, specifically Rochester Heights, which you can see pictured here, and Biltmore Hills, which have suffered nuisance flooding for a long time. So a side note before I go any further, and I do a ton of side notes, I'm sorry about that. My students find it very annoying, so does my wife. But a side note, if you notice, there's a highway going right through the middle of this community. That's why I love to show this Google map. So like right here, there's a highway going right through it. Rochester Heights and Biltmore Hills, these were the first Black neighborhoods in Raleigh. It used to be one neighborhood. But then through the 70s, we put a highway through that neighborhood and we split it up. And that's, those processes, that's an environmental injustice. It's contributing to the issues that we see in that neighborhood today. And one of those major issues is this idea of nuisance flooding. It's like, if you watch the local news and if we get serious rain, there's a good chance you see these type of images from Southeast Raleigh. So like I think when we think of flooding, we often think about this, but these communities often suffer nuisance flooding from like minor rain events. So the rain that we've had over the last couple of days, you'll see lower parts of roads covering water. People's backyards stay perpetually wet. I have 2 young kids. It's important that kids can use, especially during the course of this pandemic, your personal outdoor space is incredibly important. If your yard's perpetually wet and muddy, that's something you can't make use of. So like this like nuisance flooding, it's not quite like this where, you may have to move or your car's being flooded and taken away in these currents, but nuisance flooding really does reduce the quality of life for people in neighborhoods. So we have here a map which was created by one of my former students, Justin McGregor, and it shows what you see here is the Walnut Creek Watershed. So Biltmore Hills and Rochester Heights, these 2 neighborhoods, are the lowest point in this watershed. So the headwaters for the watershed are in Cary, and it ends somewhere out in Wake County. So whenever something is being built in Wake County or downtown Raleigh or in Cary, that impervious surface or that concrete causes more water to run off, and water runs downhill. So all those processes, all those developments impact the flooding in these communities, in these 2 neighborhoods specifically, which are at the lowest point in the watershed. So this is like, this is not a new issue. It's been happening for years since these communities were first founded. And what we see in this map is, and I apologize for the text being small, but the big thing is like, if you notice that this green space here, those are in the floodplain And those are all majority minority census tracts. So essentially what we're saying is that, like, this is mainly Southeast Raleigh, that these census tracts, which are all majority minority, are much more vulnerable to flooding than other tracts within the Walnut Creek Watershed. So, like I said, this has been happening for years. And back in 2014, some people at NC State were like, we are a part of this community. We are also part of the problem because we love to build new buildings and we love to have like our beautiful Centennial campus, but that's more impervious surface. So it should be incumbent on us to reach out to the community and start helping to address these issues. So that really led to the formation of the Walnut Creek Wetland Community Project. And for the next couple of slides, I apologize for this, but it's going to really be a story about people. People who have, taken their time to really think about these issues and who are really interested in making change. So you're going to see a lot of pictures of people, and I'm going to throw out a lot of names, but I kind of want to take you down the journey that we went through with this community to address these issues. So recognizing this issue of nuisance flooding in Southeast Raleigh, specifically these two neighborhoods, Dr. Deidre Crumbly, who you see here, my mouse is over, and Christy Perrin, who are both at NC State, came together and like, we need to do better. So in 2014, they started holding community forums on NC State's campus, trying to raise awareness of these issues with students and faculty on campus. So that was kind of the first step of the process, is trying to bring together people on campus. The next step is that they reached out to people in the city of Raleigh. The city of Raleigh has been amazing partners in trying to address these issues in these communities. I can't emphasize that enough. And specifically, we reached out to Kevin Boyer at Stormwater, Stacy Hagwood, who is the director of the Walnut Creek Wetland Center. So there's a wetland center right in the middle of Southeast Raleigh in these communities. And they reached out to David Schaus, who has since retired, but was also part of like the parks and rec for Raleigh. So we reached out and we started having meetings with people at the city and like saying like, what can we do? What can NC State do? How can we bring our resources to help address these issues? So we started having meetings with people at the city. And what we quickly realized is that nothing will get done if it's just the city and people at the universities. We really need to build sustainable and true connections to people who are actually in the community. So we reached out to Dr. Norman Camp, who has since passed away, sadly. But and the Walnut Creek Wetland Center is named after him. The group that he founded, Partners for Environmental Justice, are really responsible for having the Walnut Creek Wetland Park in Southeast Raleigh. So we reached out to Dr. Camp. We reached out to Father Taylor, who is the pastor at St. Ambrose Episcopal Church. And we also reached out to Amin Davis, who was part of Partners for Environmental Justice, but he also works at DENA for the state. So like he kind of has this dual roles of being in the community, but also working for the environment at the state level. And what we did is like, we really spent the year of 2014 getting to know each other, building relationships of trust. So we didn't publish papers, we didn't exactly go for grant funding, but we had a lot of lunches. We got to know each other, we started to develop trust, and we started to realize that, it's gonna take all of us to address these issues. But at the same time, we still realize that we're missing a piece. And that piece that we're missing is really involvement from people who are in the community members. So in 2015, my former graduate student, Dresden McGregor, started a project where we're like, we need to really start thinking. So we've been meeting with leaders, people who work in the community, we've been meeting with city leaders, and we've been meeting with NC State folks. But we need to start talking to people who are actually in the community, frontline community members who are experiencing these issues, especially nuisance flooding every day. So this process kind of got started in 2015 with a series of focus groups led by Dresden. And it was in Rochester Heights and Biltmore Hills, and we were focusing on these ideas of stormwater and green infrastructure and nuisance flooding. And our participants were amazing. They were highly educated, long-term residents. The average length of time being in these neighborhoods were 30 years. Incredibly high value for the natural environment, especially for the natural environment just outside their door. And they were all Black women. And I mention that because I think sometimes it's easier if you have a group of just all women, especially all Black women, so people aren't being talked over. I've seen a lot of times where, like, let's face it, men, we like to talk over people. So sometimes we don't get everyone's perspective. So I think Dressing convened this really special group of long-term Black women residents in the neighborhood to talk about, like, what's going on there in Biltmore Hills and Rochester Heights. And a lot of things came out of those discussions, but these are some of the top level findings that came out of that work in 2015. Like I said before, a high value on the natural environment, a high general environmental awareness. So, like, these women knew a lot about the natural environment just in general. High support and high interest in this ideas around green infrastructure. They were sick of seeing concrete being used to address stormwater issues in their neighborhood. But they had little trust in the city. So we saw there was a gap in trying to address any of this. There was like a gap in the relationship between residents in these communities and their relationship with the city. I think a lot of these residents felt like the city had not been fair with how they operate with these communities historically. And to the credit of our partners in the city, they were receptive to this message. They didn't take it personal. None of it's personal. If someone criticizes your institution, they're not criticizing you. They're just saying that historically your institution's not done this job right. And our partners at the city took this feedback and they didn't step away from the table. They said, what can we do to fix this? And then finally, there's this, and this is, I think it was tied to the fact that they had a really high general environmental awareness, this need to assess stream conditions in the neighborhood. They realized that the streams were a problem for causing flooding. So that was 2015. That work kind of helped set us up to go to American Rivers and seek a little bit of grant funding. So in 2016, American Rivers helped fund a demonstration green infrastructure project. So along with the funding from American Rivers in the city of Raleigh, we put in a demonstration rain garden at St. Ambrose Episcopal Church. So that way, you know, we knew that the community via our focus groups were interested in green infrastructure, and green infrastructure is important, but it's also expensive. Where we're like, let's put in a demonstration project so people in the community can see how it operates, and also, like, you know, to show that people are willing to make this investment in these communities. That American Rivers grant also enabled Dresden, along with another faculty member at the university, Stacy Supak, to do an assessment of the flooding situation using GIS in the neighborhood. So Dresden did a door-to-door survey with over 100 households where she asked people, where does it flood when you go out? So she took that, mapped that onto a map of the neighborhood using GIS, but she also used GIS to simulate where flooding would happen under different rain conditions. Long story short, what the residents were telling us largely lined up with what the model simulations told us. So the residents knew what they were talking about, which is always the case. There's a ton of information that could be found in these frontline communities. So this led to us like, oh, we really need to address these concerns. And I say that, and like, that should be totally expected. I imagine you're listening, you're like, yeah, of course that's the case, Louie. But so often we don't listen to frontline communities. And this is part of that recognitional piece of environmental justice. We need to recognize these experiences. And I tell people, you don't recognize it like as a handout or to make people feel good. You recognize it so you do better science. At least for me, you recognize it so you have better public policy. So that funding also helped with that. Later in 2016, we also used American Rivers funding to do some work with the Neighborhood Ecology Corps. So the Neighborhood Ecology Corps is a group of students from Southeast Raleigh, from middle school up to high school, who met weekly to learn about, you know, environmental stuff and really have experiences outdoors. So we ran a focus group with them to tell, really not a focus group, more like a chaotic classroom informational setting So they learned about green infrastructure. So we did a workshop with them to learn about green infrastructure. The exciting part about that work is that once we taught them about green infrastructure, they ran a workshop for their parents. So it was a way of us to like talk about these ideas around green infrastructure and stormwater and nuisance flooding. And we were able to reach a whole, demographic that's traditionally really hard to reach, parents with children. And we were able to reach them because we went through their children. So that work was also funded by American Rivers. And all this work is centered in Rochester Heights and Biltmore Hills. So in 2016 through 2017, we continue to make that funding stretch through American Rivers by partnering with Theo Jace, who was a postdoc for Ryan Emanuel. Ryan is at NC State University, an amazing professor, and Theo has since moved on to another position. But they were willing to cost share with us, so they had equipment already, which could measure stream conditions. They were willing to use, what little money we had left over from our American Rivers grant to measure the stream conditions in the community, because that was one of the top level concerns that came out of our focus groups. And aside, I tell people that it's communities. I think they appreciate when someone like me comes there, a social scientist who understands what's happening in the community, who's willing to listen and can provide some historical context. But they don't need me. What they need are physical scientists who can address the material and technical conditions that they're facing on the ground. What they need are people who can fix those problems, who understand that they can be partners. So that's why it was really important that we were able to partner with Ryan. And they measured the stream conditions in the neighborhoods for a year. And what they had was when it rains, you have some pretty serious issues with these stream conditions. So we started this project in 2014. We've gotten small funding here, small funding there. We've been able to bring in grad students to work with us. And, I think we were doing pretty good work, but it was all kind of small projects. And, you can only ask a community to keep engaging with you for so long without having some type of bigger outcome for them, because people's time is very valuable. So in 2018, we were finally able to get funded for a fairly larger project via the Conservation Fund. The Conservation Fund funded us to be part of their Parks with Purpose project. And this is a program where they are intentionally creating parks in underserved and minority communities that have equity and justice at the very core of these parks. So this project lines up perfectly with these principles of environmental justice that we're really trying to have guide our work in these communities. So we were fortunate that they selected us to be one of their sites for this Parks with Purpose program. And this brought in a whole new set of amazing people for us to work with. Shannon Lee, who is at the Conservation Fund, and Stacia Turner, who was there when we started the project and has since left for another position. But they kind of became our points people for working with the Conservation Fund. And they've been doing this for years across the country. So they brought in a wealth of knowledge to help us do this kind of work in Biltmore Heights and Biltmore Hills and Rochester Heights. And I think this project was important because if you remember when I was first talking about environmental justice, I think we often think about environmental justice, we think about the exposure that happens to minority and underserved communities. But just as important is the fact that these communities don't have access to parks and to the best parts in the environment. So this Parks with Purpose program, to me, is incredibly important because it addresses a part of the environmental justice equation that we often don't address. And that's access to good green space, to good natural environmental spaces that is driven by the community's needs and concerns. So we get that funding in 2018. And part of this process is we need to do an even deeper dive into the community. And we need to start thinking about what does the community need in a park? Well, I don't know how to do that. Our team doesn't know how to do that. But Kofi Boone does know how to do it. So Kofi Boone's at North Carolina State University, part of the landscape architecture program. And he worked with us along with his class throughout the course of 2019, and they did a series of design charrettes, and they helped us engage with local community members purposely to think about what do they want in a park? What would they want to see in a park? So this continues that building of a foundation of trust between community members and between us. And I'm grateful for all these people at NC State who can take their expertise and help do this work. So to further build on Kofi's work, we realized that we need to get even more participation from people in the community. So that's when we partner with Jackie Turner from Turner Consulting. And she's an expert in community engagement. And Jackie really helped us take our community engagement to the next level. I would say that beforehand, we were reaching the people that you would typically reach in the community. Often that's retired people, more affluent people who have time to engage with you. I think Jackie helped us reach people that maybe don't have time, or it's not easy for them to engage with you. So that involved, doing things on the weekend, doing things at the evening, having daycare when you did your activities, going door to door. So a lot of this was driven by our engagement with Jackie, and all for figuring out what type of park works best for these communities. Then finally, we did this work through 2018, 2019, and we got to the point where, like, you know what, we're ready to do a bid to go to a firm to design our park, to create a formal design. So we went through that process, and we ended up choosing Design Workshop, which is also located in Raleigh, to work with us. And the principals for Design Workshop on our project are Emily McCoy, and Corey Dodd closely works with her, and he's kind of like he's the liaison between them and our community and our project, and he's interned at Design Workshop, and he's been integral to what we're trying to do. So we're really moving along. We've been doing this work, and we're excited to start working with Design Workshop. And I should say, this entire time, we're not losing people in our circle. So we're still talking to people of the city. We're still talking about it to people in NC State. We're definitely still talking to community members and community leaders. And we're in the community. We're doing work. We're seeing people. We have quarterly meetings. We're having dinner together. We're going from home to home. And the work feels really fulfilling. When I talk to my parents about what I do as a job, I talk about projects like this. They don't want to hear about my experiment and survey work. They want to hear about work like this that really serves the community. But we all know what happened. COVID-19. And COVID-19 was it was really pivotal for our work. So if we're going to engage in frontline communities and underserved minority communities, you need to be there. You have to show your face. Well, COVID-19 put an end to that. So in 2020, our work changed drastically. So we couldn't do the face-to-face. A lot of our sessions moved to online, and there are other concerns. But again, I cannot emphasize this enough, how important partnership is and how important it is to have really good partners. I am eternally grateful to the Conservation Fund and to Shannon and to Stacia. And they were creative in how they thought about the funding they were provided us. So initially the funding is let's work towards putting a park in here that can really be a park that has equity and justice as core. And I tell people this all the time, just randomly, the Conservation Fund really does care about that. Because in 2020, they continued our funding, and they allowed us to do things that the community needed at that time with that funding. So the Conservation Fund funded us to provide masks to community members. So we were able, so when we sent out a mailing to give people an update about what we were doing at the park, we could also send them a mask. St. Ambrose was doing a food drive. The Conservation Fund gave money to help with the food drive, to provide people with funding. And it touches me because they went above and beyond. But that's what we need to do to address these environmental justice issues, to work with people in these communities. We just can't stick to the day-to-day typical business. We have to do things differently. And I appreciate that the Conservation Fund was willing to do things differently to keep up this work. So that's 2020. And really that was most of 2020, just kind of making sure basic needs were met, or helping people who are doing the work and making basic needs, and like trying not to lose all momentum on the project. So Design Workshop is still doing their work throughout 2020, designing the park. And, you know, as we start 2021, Design Workshop, Emily and Corey are very much at work. We just had a meeting 2 weeks ago with a artist who won our art competition. So we're going to install art on the site. So the park's not there yet, but we want to put art there. So there's something that people see that things are moving on. And also, you know, Christy and the people who run the project haven't stopped doing work. So in 2020, end of 2021, we applied for a grant through the EPA to install green infrastructure at Biltmore Hills Park Community Center to address flooding issues and nuisance flooding issues that come due to the impervious surface around the center. And that was really headed up by Christy and Grace Fulmer, who became part of our team 2 years ago, in coordination with Chris Bass Engineering, another local firm that does a lot of good work across the Triangle. So I know this is kind of a rambling story, but there's some lessons that I've taken away from this process. This work takes time. So if you notice, I've been purposely putting the year on top. All of this, we started this work, or I became part of this work in 2014. And it's 2021. That's not a normal grant cycle. That's like not a normal educational, that's not like a PhD cycle. It's not a master's degree cycle. So working with communities, addressing environmental issues, it takes time. It takes time to build trust. It takes time to really see change. So we have to think about forming lasting relationships. I hope I've emphasized that it takes a village. It takes a lot of people to do this work. I think you need to reach out to people to make sure you can help. There's all types of expertise that are needed to do this work, and you need to reach out to those people. And I think in coordination with this idea that it takes a village, it also, you know, you have to be humble. So like, I think, and this is more for academics. I often direct this towards academics. So people in the audience, this isn't so much directed towards you, but I think a lot of times us academics go into the community and we're like, I have the answer, or I've been trained, I know what to do. But often we don't. And often people in the community they do know more about the issue than we do. So we have to be humble and be willing to learn from them. Then we also have to be humble and go to other people for help, other professions, other fields. We also have to be willing to share resources. Grant money needs to go to people who are going to do the front line on the ground work. So like, these are the lessons learned. And then finally, and then this is going to go into like, you know, a kind of a short, like 10-minute addendum to my talk. I think for this work to happen, for like true environmental justice work and like true equity work to happen, it takes a change in mindset. So unfortunately, people like Ben Shapiro have ruined the red pill analogy from the Matrix. But I think it really does take changing the way you think about the United States, the way you think about justice, and the way you think about equity. And what do I mean by that? I think I think often when we think about America, we think about, of course, like apple pie or baseball. I was going to put football there because I think football is way more popular than baseball now, but you know, people say apple pie and baseball. So like, I think we recognize those are core parts of America. And I think we often think about the oppression, the systems of oppression, the racism, the sexism, those other, you know, isms, these kind of negative oppressive systems. I think we think those are accidental. Those are byproducts of the progress that they're making in the United States. But I think if you really want to engage in this work, I think you have to change your mindset and think about oppression is core to the story of the United States. It's really a major part of how we can think about our narrative of citizens. And what do I mean by that? Let's think about how Black people got here. is via slavery. And when I give this talk to students, I think slavery is too kind of a term for what we had here in the United States. We were separating families, we were raping women, we were maiming men to produce cotton. So that's how we brought our first minority group, African Americans. That's how Black people got here. Fortunately, we had the Civil War, and we abolished slavery. And we went to this period of Reconstruction. So you have this picture down here of Black senators and Black congressmen. And this is a short period of time in the United States, about 10 to 15 years, but it's an incredibly important time that we don't think about enough. So think about it. We have people who were brought here on ships and chains, who have seen the worst of our country. They're freed, and 3 years later, they're running their own communities. They're thriving, they're flourishing. They're in the Senate, they're in the House, they're helping to govern our country. And I think it's important to highlight the importance of Reconstruction because it shows that these communities are functional. So I think too often when we go to like marginalized and minority communities, we see the problems that's happening in these communities and we assume that, oh, it's just because they can't govern themselves or there's something wrong with these communities. But that's a fiction. We have history to show us that these communities there's exceptional people in these communities. These communities are exceptional. This is amazing. They go from slavery, they go from chains to the White House or to the Congress. It's amazing. So we had this period of Reconstruction. But what happened in Reconstruction? We had our first impeachment, which is unfortunately relevant today. So we had Andrew Johnson, who ended Reconstruction. And that directly led to this installment of the Jim Crow system throughout. And we often think of Jim Crow being in the South, but it was really throughout the country. There were vestiges of Jim Crow. So we started Jim Crow. We had white supremacy groups have a foothold in that. And we also started the prison pipe. We also started systemic imprisonment of Black people, really to replace that lost slave labor. We need cheap labor. So we had that little period of Reconstruction, but it was ended, and we went to this period of Jim Crow. And we're in Jim Crow up to the Civil Rights era. And we had the Civil Rights Movement. And, through the work of a lot of amazing people, often amazing Black women who we often don't hear about, but we hear about MLK, definitely. And, Lyndon Johnson pushing through legislation, we got the Civil Rights Act, we got the Voting Rights Act. And we saw some change happen. But as it happens so often in our country, and that's why I want to think about changing how we think about the narrative of the United States to do this type of justice equity work, we killed people, literally killed the people moving this work. So you have the assassination of Malcolm X, the assassination of MLK, the assassination of Bobby Kennedy, the assassination of the leaders of the Black Panthers, violent, grisly murders. So like on one hand, we can see we had this Civil Rights Act, but at the same time, we have this kind of violence reaction to the people who are leading these movements. And while the Civil Rights Act did happen and we did see advancement, at the same time, we saw more pervasive systems being created, such as redlining. So like, we got rid of Jim Crow, but we created redlining. And redlining is incredibly important to think about when we think about why is it that we have certain Black, brown, and underserved poor communities who are being constantly exposed to the worsening environment. It's not an accident. Those are the only places that we said that these people could live. And you can make so redlining was done by our federal government. So you can make an argument that redlining went up to the late 80s in certain parts of the country. So there's this direct connection from slavery up to redlining, where we're really purposely marginalizing parts of our population. But you're like, okay, Louie, we got rid of redlining. Yes, we got rid of redlining to some degree, but then we go to like even more insidious practices such as credit scores. So credit scores, there's a heavily racial, it's an opaque box. It determines where you can get, it determines who's able to get a mortgage, what type of terms they can get, what banks they can work with. And if you look at the research around it, it's heavily racialized. statistically, African Americans and people of color have much lower credit scores than other groups. And that limits where they can live. So again, these communities are not in these places where they're exposed to the worst of the environment and kept away from the best parts of the environment on accident. And this really has manifested in all types of things that we see. So like, you know, we definitely see like the police violence, which was highlighted with the death of George Floyd. We see also like, you know, just really depressing maternal health statistics for Black mothers. You know, it's incredibly dangerous to be a Black woman giving birth in the United States. And even today with coronavirus, we're seeing the vestiges of this history and who's suffering the most. Deaths are much higher amongst Black people than other people in the country. So I go through this kind of depressing history, and I often give this talk to like freshmen, you know, kids coming right into college. And what I tell them is that I go through this and I go through it not to blame you. None of us in the audience, we didn't create these systems. You know, we are just living in these systems. But I say, you know, in closing, we didn't create these systems. But if you're not actively fighting against these systems, if you're not actively fighting for justice and equity, then you are starting to benefit from the systems and you're helping them to stay in place. So what I tell the kids is that like, you're a freshman, you know, you're just getting into college, and like, none of this is your fault. Truly none of it's your fault. But you know, if you get to be my age at 43 and things are still like this and you're not actively fighting against it, guess what? You have ownership of this system. So that's it. In closing, I just want to like, you know, highlight the work that we've done in Southeast Raleigh. I've already shown a ton of people, but way more people have been involved. So like, I'm an extremely, very, very small part of that work. And it's just been the work of like so many people coming together to do this work. So I hope I did not rattle on too long, and I'd be glad to take any questions. Oh, let me stop share. It's on my messy desktop. Sorry about that.
Dr. Rivers, thank you so much. That was impressive. The work that you've been doing is incredible. I mean, it's such a, I mean, you said it, right? It's such a testament to the commitment that it takes in order to get change, and that these things don't just happen with one community information meeting or one, you know, like survey form that you distribute, that it really does take talking to communities, sitting down and really never getting up. Like you get into the community and you're, if you want to get something done that really is meaningful, you're just planning to never leave.
I think that's
the kind of engagement. And I guess that's the only real way to get trust in any community, and then to begin to understand what the needs of the community are. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, I think, you know, I have another version of this talk that I give to different audiences that really centers this idea of building trust. So I think trust is central to any type of engagement work. And, you know, it's cliche, but it's true. Trust is hard to earn, easy to lose. And it takes time to form trust.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to remind everybody who's tuned in still, drop your questions and experiences into the chat and comments boxes. I've got those pulled up, and I am now going to see what is going on over here and throw some questions at you, Dr. Rivers, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So let's see. The first one that I'm seeing here, Lisa's asking, how can we get the word out about your work and this particular partnership model to other communities and to students who may have an interest in doing this work?
I think you know, going back to the Conservation Fund, they have this Parks with Purpose project. I think they do a really great job of like letting people know about that. In terms of students, I'm not sure. I'm not good about that part. I think the city does a great job of highlighting this type of work. And again, I want to emphasize, I'm not trying to be humble. It's just like the truth. The really hard work is being done by the people in the community and the people at the city. And if anything, I think we should be really appreciative of our city staff, especially people in Raleigh. There's some amazing people working for the city of Raleigh, and some amazing people working for the state of North Carolina, the Department of Environment and Natural Resources. So I don't know if that's the best answer, but I think really look into these people who are right there in the community who are doing this work, and you never hear about what they're doing.
That's a good opportunity to bring up. I think we've got at least one representative of Raleigh Stormwater who's tuned in. Hi, Wayne, and has offered up even contact information in order to, continue working on these partnerships and building connections. Speaks to the point you're just making. They're here with us. Okay. Let's see. The next question on the list: is there canoe access to Walnut Creek in Rochester Heights and Biltmore Hills?
No, there is not right now. So if you've been in that area, the banks are extremely pretty steep, so it's difficult to get in. And also there's to alter areas in the wetland, which would be near the stream, would require considerable paperwork and going through a pretty extensive process. So like that, if we were to put in facilities right there, it would have to go through a NEPA process, National Environmental Protection Act, which is a lot of paperwork to make sure that you're not doing things to make the floodplain or to make this landscape worse. So that was a long way of saying no. Right. Not in the neighborhood. Yeah.
All right. It is interesting to think about all of the different ways that people recreate outdoors, mm-hmm. and the kinds of spaces that people would want access to, in their own communities. Okay, let's see. I lost my place. Okay, let's see. How, if at all, have the neighborhood ecology core continued since COVID? Have students been able to meet together virtually or limited in person?
So the neighborhood ecology core is going through a period of, I'm just plugging in my computer here. I think it's been difficult to meet over COVID, but the city, so originally the neighborhood ecology core is really kind of ran by Randy Cisnick. I always have problems saying his last name, but since then it's transferred to the city. So I think the city of Raleigh is in the process of kind of reshaping what the neighborhood ecology core is. And I'm hoping that once the pandemic ends, it can come back to meeting regularly and providing opportunities for these kids.
Christy is asking, is there similar work being done anywhere in Eastern North Carolina?
I don't want to say no. I'm not aware of it. But I appreciate someone bringing up this idea of Eastern North Carolina, because Eastern North Carolina is where a lot of our EJ issues are happening. So you have, these huge hog farms, which are nasty. You have encroaching of seawater, of ocean water. So you have salinization of fresh water in the coastal area. So that's changing habitats. And then you have kind of like the Outer Banks where tourists go over the inner coastal area to the Outer Banks, but also so does a lot of the government funded. So I think there is need for this type of work in Eastern North Carolina. And I think due to the fact that it's not close to any major universities besides Eastern North Carolina, but even Eastern North Carolina is not a super Eastern university if you look at the map of the state. There's a lot of communities out there that will benefit from this type of work, and they are not currently have access to it.
That actually gets me into a question from Brian, who works for a certain state institution in the eastern part of the state. Brian is asking, or wants to hear more about building trust. What advice do you have for state institutions to start that process?
I would say first, I feel bad for state institutions because I think, so when I say trust building requires time, really what I'm saying, it requires money. You know, in the best of all worlds, if I'm a state institution and I want to build trust with a community, I hire a staff person, and that staff person, that community is their responsibility. So you have a liaison who can spend time and really develop relationships with them. So I think a big part of it is like spending time in that community and having people who learn that community. I think, yeah, we need to spend time listening to the concerns of frontline communities. And that's a process of time. And at the state level or for agencies, that time means money. Because everybody's already stretched. People have like 20 different things to do already. So I'm asking you to add on another thing. And at times, this other thing is going to seem meandering. Because like you're like, okay, I just had lunch with someone. What does this mean? Well, maybe that someone tells their neighbor about you. You know, you may not see benefits from that lunch for like 2 or 3 months, or maybe not at all. So I think spending time in communities and listening is important. And also going to a community before something bad happens. If people associate you with just coming there when something bad is happening, that's not a good way to start your relationship.
Get to know them before the dam breaks.
Yes.
All right. Let's see. Catherine is wanting to know if you've worked with the One Wake group, who's interested in working on environmental justice in Raleigh.
No, I have not. I mean, there's all types of groups doing this work. So like I said, my work has really been in these 2 neighborhoods. I'm interested in working with other groups and seeing, you know, potential collaboration.
Excellent. Excellent. Georgia's writing, what do you see as the trajectory for justice with folks like Michael Regan at the EPA?
I mean, I think I'm excited that he is, he's there. And so another hat I wear is that I am on the board of scientific advisors for the EPA right now. And I serve on the air and climate, not air and climate, we had to change it due to the previous administration, the air and energy subcommittee. So I work with the people at the EPA, and there's a lot of people in the EPA who are really dedicated to this idea of environmental justice, who really care about it. So I'm excited that I think he showed that he was interested here at the state level, and I'm hoping that he picks up with that at the federal level. I think there's a lot of people interested in doing this work in the EPA. This is one of my sides. I don't think people realize how hard people at the EPA work. It's an amazing agency full of incredibly smart people who are taking a material loss to work for society, i.e. they're taking a lot less pay to do something because they care about the environment. So I think I'm hoping that he is able to harness, you know, these feelings in the EPA. And I'm hoping that he reaches back to people in the EJ community in North Carolina. North Carolina has a really strong EJ community. So maybe he picks someone out here to help him do that work. Like an Omega Wilson, or like, you know, there's so many people that can be suggested to do that work. So I'm hoping that he reaches back to the activists and people that work here in North Carolina to help him do this work at a federal level.
Karen writes that this is an amazing project and an inspiring call to action. Thanks, Karen. Do you feel like the impact of upstream projects like Downtown South on downstream neighborhoods is being considered by the city of Raleigh?
I mean, if you followed that project, the Planning Commission voted against it, but the city approved it. And I think the Planning Commission did a really good job of reaching out to communities and considering the impacts of that project on a lot of different communities. So I'm not in those rooms, so I can't say what's happening, but that's a lot of concrete being put into the system.
All right, let's see. 5 minutes left in today's program. Couple of questions left here in the chat. Are you involved in the formation of Freedom Park in downtown Raleigh?
No. But I think I know people who are, and there's good people working with that park, and there are also good people working with Dorothea Dix Park, which is another huge process happening in the city.
Yeah, we've had some folks a part of that process be a part of this lecture series too. Folks can go back in the archive and find some of those programs where they've talked about the meetings and focus groups and community partnerships that they've been trying to work on there. Let's see. Virginia's asking, how can citizens concerned about local parks get Parks with Purpose engaged?
So the Parks with Purpose is a grant program. If you go to Conservation's Fund, if you Google Parks with Purpose, you can go to their grant program. And I'm not sure if when their next call for new people will be, but essentially it's applying for it via a grants process. And it's not just for academic institutions. We're kind of like an outlier. So our sister cities are Baltimore, Durham, and Atlanta. And we're the only partner that's really has a university as part of the team. So I think we're kind of an outlier. So most of the groups who are getting this are community groups who see this call and they apply for it.
All right, excellent. Tina, watching on Facebook, wants to know, do you have an opinion on Pigeon House Branch?
No, I don't know about that.
I'm
sorry.
Me either. Sorry, Tina. We might have to find a way to get back to you on that one. All right. Well, everything else that I'm looking at in the chat box is people saying, this is amazing, so awesome. Heart emojis. This is giving me goosebumps. We need more flexibility to think outside the box with funding. Great use of expertise available at NC State. And generally all around great feelings for you being here.
Well, in closing, I just really, again, the partners, I cannot emphasize enough how amazing Christy Perrin is, Grace Fulmer, the people at the design workshop, the people at the city of Raleigh. I mean, I keep bringing that up, but I really do feel for state and city employees because often you're the face of bad news and that can't be fun. And you don't get paid much and you don't have much funding and you're being asked to do a ton of work. So I am highly appreciative of the people in Stormwater and Parks and Rec who have worked with us through this process. And they, I can't say enough about how great, you have amazing people working for you in Raleigh.
Excellent stuff. Well, we'll everybody, wherever you're watching, a round of applause for the public servants out there.
Yeah.
But keep the round of applause going for Dr. Louie Rivers, who's done a fantastic job with today's Lunchtime Discovery presentation. Dr. Rivers, thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you for giving me some time.
Excellent stuff. This video will remain on the museum's YouTube channel, our Facebook page. It'll be there for folks to access. As long as there's a museum and a YouTube, I think we'll find a way to keep this one going so that folks can come back to it and learn about the history of projects like this and maybe glean some insights on how to adopt those practices, networks, and partnerships for their own environmental justice programs all over the place. So thank you. Hey, everybody. I'll remind you, we're going to be continuing the Black History Month series for the rest of the Wednesdays in February. So go ahead and mark your calendar to be with us here next Wednesday at noon and the one after that. Check out eenorthcarolina.org for the schedule of upcoming presentations. The Office of Environmental Education, that's their site, and you can see what's coming up. You can also find the schedule at the museum site, naturalsciences.org. You can follow the museum on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram for updates on all kinds of science and nature programming. We're at Natural Sciences on all 3 platforms. Oh, and you can follow the Office of Environmental Education on Twitter to get updates as well. They're at North Carolina EE, so that you can stay tuned with what they've got going on. And is there a way you shared? Is there a way that folks should keep in touch with you if they want to know what's going on?
So there's my email address. Again, sorry for my messy desktop. Email is the best way to get in touch with me. I would say follow me on Twitter, but I mainly post about comic books, so you will be probably disappointed.
Maybe I'll drop a link in the chat, so if folks want the comic book Twitter, they can check it out. All right, everybody. Thanks for being here. We'll see you next week. Bye, everybody.